The smell of hickory smoke was still hanging over my driveway when my daughter's husband picked up the model boat I'd spent 4 months building and threw it into the fire pit. It hit the flames handle first, the sail catching in under a second, and he wiped his palms together like he'd just taken out the trash. You don't need toys at your age, Walt. Maybe it's time somebody talked to you about what's actually going on upstairs. I stood there in front of everyone I love and watched 31 years of my late wife's patience burn down to a black skeleton of balsa wood. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to say something to whoever's listening tonight, wherever you are. Maybe you're driving home from a shift you didn't want to work. Maybe you're lying in bed next to someone who's already asleep. Wherever you are, whatever chair you're sitting in, I'm glad you're here with me. Some names in this story have been changed to protect people who don't know they're in it yet, but everything that matters is true, and I think you'll understand why by the end. My name is Walter Doyle. I'm 66 years old, and I spent 38 years as a machinist at a tool and die plant outside Erie, Pennsylvania, before my knees gave out and my hands started shaking too much to trust around a lathe. I built things for a living. That's the only way I know how to describe myself that means anything. I built things, and when the plant let me go with a pension and a handshake, I kept building things. Just smaller ones. Model ships mostly. Wooden hulls, real rigging, sails. I sewed myself on my wife, Carol's old machine, because throwing it out after she passed felt like throwing out a piece of her hands. Carol died 4 years ago. Heart. Sudden. No warning. Gone between one Tuesday and the next. She used to sit in the recliner across from my workbench in the garage with a mystery novel in her lap and watch me work for hours without saying a word. And when I finished a piece, whatever it was, she'd hold it up to the light and say the same thing every time. Well, Walt, you did it again. That garage has been quiet for 4 years except for the radio and my own breathing. And the boat I was building the night my son-in-law burned it was going to be the biggest thing I'd ever finished. A 3-masted schooner, 41 inches stem to stern, built from a kit I'd special ordered from a shop in Maine because Carol had always wanted to see the tall ships in Bar Harbor, and we never made the trip. I was going to finish it in time for what would have been our 40th anniversary and put it on the mantle where she could, in whatever way a person believes these things, see it. That Saturday was my granddaughter Emma's 9th birthday party. My daughter Renee had asked me to bring the boat, even unfinished, because Emma loved watching me work on it during her visits, loved asking what each little brass fitting was for. I'd wrapped it in a moving blanket and carried it out to the backyard myself, careful the way you carry something that's taken 4 months of steady hands, and set it on the picnic table under the string lights while the burgers went on the grill. Renee is 34, a physical therapist at the regional hospital, sharp and kind and stubborn in the exact way her mother was stubborn, which is to say she believes in giving people the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt has run out. She married Marcus Farrell 6 years ago. Marcus sells commercial insurance, the kind of man who shakes your hand a half-second too long and calls you champ if he can't remember your name, though he'd known mine for 6 years by then. He drove a leased Cadillac Escalade that he replaced every 2 years and wore a watch that cost more than my first car, and I never once saw him fix anything with his own 2 hands in all the time I'd known him. That's not a crime. I want to be fair about that. Plenty of good men have never held a wrench. But there's a way some men look at things that took another man months to build. And Marcus looked at my boat the way you look at a chore somebody left for you to clean up. The party was going the way birthday parties go. Kids running through the sprinkler, the smell of charcoal, Emma's friends fighting over the piñata rope. My son Danny had driven up from Pittsburgh with his wife and their new baby, and for about 2 hours it felt like something Carol would have recognized. A yard full of noise that meant the family was still a family. Then Marcus came over to the picnic table where I'd set the boat down to check the rigging, and he picked it up. Not gently. He turned it over in his hands the way you'd turn over a stapler you were thinking about buying, squinted at the hull, and said, loud enough for half the yard to hear it, "This is what you spend your Social Security check on? Little toy boats?" A few people laughed, the nervous kind of laugh people do when they're not sure if something's a joke. I told him it wasn't a toy, that it was a scratch build. Real teak decking, hand-rigged, and that I'd been working on it 4 months. He nodded like that made it worse instead of better and said, "Walt, my dad's your age. He plays golf. He doesn't sit in a garage gluing sticks together like a 3rd grader." Renee called his name from across the yard, half a warning, half an apology already forming on her face. Marcus didn't look at her. He looked at me, and something in his face shifted. Something that had been sitting under the surface for longer than that one afternoon, and he said the thing that I'll remember for the rest of my life exactly the way he said it. You don't need toys at your age, Walt. Maybe it's time somebody talked to you about what's actually going on upstairs. And then, like it was nothing, like it was the natural next move in a conversation he'd already finished having in his head, he walked the 3 steps to the fire pit where we'd been roasting marshmallows for the kids, and he dropped my boat into the flames. The sail caught first. Carol's sewing machine had stitched that sail, and I watched the thread go orange and then black in about 4 seconds. Nobody moved. Danny's wife pulled their baby's face into her shoulder like she was shielding him from something. Emma started crying, the confused crying of a kid who doesn't understand why the grown-ups have gone so quiet. Renee's hand came up over her mouth. I want to tell you something honest, something I've thought about a great deal in the weeks since. My first instinct, 66 years old, standing in my own daughter's backyard, was to laugh it off. To say something like, well, guess I needed the fire lit anyway, and keep the peace, keep the birthday party rolling, keep everybody comfortable. Carol used to tease me about that, called it my Doyle diplomacy, my habit of swallowing an insult whole rather than let a room go uncomfortable. I opened my mouth to do exactly that. And then I looked at the fire pit and thought about 4 months of evenings in that garage, thought about Carol in the recliner saying, well, Walt, you did it again. Thought about Bar Harbor and the tall ships we never got to see together. And something in me that had been quiet for 4 years simply refused to laugh it off one more time. Marcus's keys were sitting on the corner of the picnic table, right next to the melted plastic corner of a juice box lid. A fob for that leased Escalade, black leather, the little prancing crest on the front he liked people to notice. I picked it up. He was still standing by the fire pit, brushing his palms together like he'd handled something dirty, and he saw me pick up the fob, and something flickered across his face, a half second of, wait. I walked to the above-ground pool at the edge of the yard, the one we'd set up for Emma every summer since she was 4, 8 feet across and 4 feet deep, still churning gently from the filter pump. I held the fob out over the water. Walt, Marcus said, and for the first time all afternoon there was nothing smug in his voice at all. I let it go. It hit the water and sank, a small trail of bubbles, gone. It's just a car key, I said. You'll live. I want to tell you what happened in the next 60 seconds because I think it tells you everything you need to know about where this family actually stood, underneath all the birthday cake and sparklers. Marcus didn't come at me. He didn't even really look at me. He turned to Renee, both hands out like he was the injured party in this exchange, and said, "Do you see what he just did? Do you see what your father just did?" And Renee, my daughter, the one who used to fall asleep on my chest when she was small enough to fit there, looked at the fire pit where the last black curl of sail was folding in on itself, looked at me, and then looked at Marcus's car keys sitting on the bottom of a kiddie pool, and asked the question that told me everything. Dad, do you have any idea what it costs to replace one of those? Not, are you okay? Not, why would he do that? The key. I stood there in the smoke with my hands empty at my sides, and something settled in my chest that felt less like anger and more like clarity. The kind of clarity you get when a fog lifts off a lake and you can finally see how far the shore actually is. I didn't say much else that afternoon. I helped Danny load the leftover food into containers, hugged Emma goodbye and told her the boat wasn't her fault, not one bit of it, and drove home to my quiet house on Vine Street with the garage light still burning from 4 months of evenings that had ended in ash. That night, I called Danny. My son doesn't say much, takes after Carol's side of the family that way, careful with his words. I told him what happened, plain, no embellishing, and there was a long pause on the line before he said, "Dad, I need you to tell me something honest. Has Marcus said anything to you before this? About money, about the house, anything?" I told him no, nothing specific, but that something had felt off for a while now. A certain kind of attention Marcus paid to things that weren't his business. Danny went quiet again and then said, "I want you to be careful. I don't have proof of anything, but I've had a feeling about that man for 2 years, and I never said anything because Renee loves him, and I didn't want to be the brother who ruins Christmas over a feeling." I told him I understood exactly what he meant, because I'd been carrying the same feeling myself, unspoken, for longer than I wanted to admit. 2 weeks passed. Renee called twice, both times circling around an apology that never quite landed, both times mentioning, almost in passing, that Marcus had been really stressed lately, and that maybe I could meet him halfway about the whole boat thing. I asked her once, straight out, if anyone had apologized for burning something I built with my own hands in front of my granddaughter. The silence on the line told me the answer before she said, "It's complicated, Dad." The first visit came on a Wednesday. I was in the garage, sweeping up sawdust and glue scraps from a project I hadn't had the heart to start yet, when Marcus's Escalade pulled into my driveway. He got out alone, sleeves rolled up, sunglasses pushed onto his head, the whole posture of a man arriving to smooth something over. "Walt," he said, crouching down to look at my empty workbench like it was suddenly the most interesting thing in Erie County. "Listen, I wanted to come by man to man. I think that whole thing at the party got blown out of proportion." I told him a grown man had thrown 4 months of my work into a fire in front of a 9-year-old, and I didn't consider that blown out of proportion. I considered it exactly the size it was. He had the decency to look uncomfortable for about 2 seconds before he straightened up and looked around my garage instead, at the tools on the pegboard, at the framed photo of Carol and me on our wedding day sitting on the shelf above the workbench, and I watched his eyes move across that room the way a man's eyes move when he's pricing something. "This place has good bones," he said. "You know, property values on Vine Street have almost doubled the last 5 years. Corner lot. This size garage. You could get real money for a place like this." I told him I wasn't selling anything. He smiled, said he was just making conversation, and left 10 minutes later. 4 days after that, Renee came with him, carrying a box of the good donuts from the bakery downtown, and hugged me at the door in a way that made my chest ache because I believed she meant it. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table Carol and I had eaten breakfast at for 31 years, and Marcus set his coffee down and said he and Renee had been talking about long-term planning, and pulled out his phone to show me glossy photos of a senior living community 40 minutes outside the city, all bright hallways and staged smiles. "It's not what you think, Walt," he said. "It's not a nursing home. It's independent living, resort style, really." I told him I wasn't interested in living anywhere that had a brochure. Renee leaned forward, her hands wrapped too tight around her coffee mug, and said, "Dad, we just worry about you being alone out here. This house is a lot for one person." I told her I liked being alone in a house full of memories more than I'd like being surrounded by strangers in a place that smelled like disinfectant, and called bingo a social enrichment activity. She didn't laugh. Neither did Marcus. That told me something too. I drove them out an hour later, watched the Escalade back down my driveway, Renee's hand raised in a small wave through the window that felt less like affection and more like an apology she didn't have the words for yet. I went back inside, sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, and thought hard about the sequence of things. The fire, the comment about property values, the brochure. Taken alone, each one was something a man could explain away. Taken together, they were starting to form a shape I didn't like. The next Saturday, my neighbor, Ray Kaczmarek, knocked on my back door before 8 in the morning, still in his flannel robe, holding a mug of coffee he hadn't finished making before he decided this couldn't wait. Ray's 71, a retired postal carrier, been my neighbor for 19 years, was at Carol's funeral, sat with me on my porch more evenings than I can count in the year after she died, just so the house wouldn't feel so empty. "Walt," he said, turning his cap in his hands the way he does when something's bothering him. "I've been going back and forth about whether to tell you something, and I decided I'd rather you be annoyed with me than blindsided." He sat down across from me and told me that about 3 weeks earlier, a Thursday morning, he'd been out front trimming his hedge when Marcus pulled up in the Escalade with another man beside him, younger, maybe 30, dressed sharp with a leather folder under his arm. They'd walked the entire perimeter of my property, Ray said. Front yard, side yard, all the way around the back by the garage. The younger man had been taking pictures on his phone, and then Ray heard Marcus say, clear as anything, "Once we get Walt moved into Fairview, this lot alone is worth 400, easy, and that's before the garage conversion. Get me comps on Maple and Cedar by Friday." I sat very still at my own kitchen table and felt something in my chest go cold and steady all at once. Ray told me the younger man had left a business card in my mailbox on the way out. and he'd taken it out and set it on my table before I even asked. White card, heavy stock, a name I didn't recognize. Tyler Brannigan, Keystone Realty Partners, Erie, Pennsylvania. I should have told you sooner, Ray said. I kept thinking maybe I heard it wrong. I told him he hadn't heard it wrong. 40 years around machinery teaches you that your ears tell you the truth more often than people want to believe. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't call Renee. I called my attorney instead, a man named Gerald Fisk who'd handled Carol's estate 4 years earlier and had told me at the time that his door stayed open if I ever needed it again. His office was above a pharmacy on State Street. Same smell of old carpet and coffee it had the first time I sat in that chair grieving my wife. Gerald listened to the whole thing without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. And when I finished, he set his pen down and said something that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. Walt, Marcus Farrell, has called this office 3 times in the last 4 months. He opened a call log. The first call, back in the spring, Marcus had asked general questions about what happens to a homeowner's property if the owner is later found to lack capacity, who gains control, whether family can initiate a sale on the person's behalf. The second call, weeks later, he'd asked about the guardianship process in Pennsylvania, what medical documentation a court would require to declare an elderly relative incapacitated. Gerald had told him both times that he couldn't discuss matters involving a current client and offered to refer him elsewhere. Marcus never took the referral. He called a third time 6 weeks ago and asked whether a power of attorney could authorize the sale of a home while the original owner was still alive. Specifically, if that owner had been placed in a care facility. I stood up out of my chair without deciding to. He's not planning to inherit this house, I said. He's planning to take it while I'm still breathing. Gerald looked at me steady over his glasses and said that was exactly the shape of it, and that in 26 years of practicing law in this county, those weren't the questions a concerned son-in-law asked out of idle curiosity. We spent the next 3 weeks the way you'd expect. Gerald drew up a revocable living trust that moved the house out of my name and into an independent legal entity with him as trustee, which meant any guardianship petition aimed at declaring me incapacitated would have no power over the property at all. We filed an updated medical directive naming Gerald, not Renee, as my healthcare decision-maker, not because I doubted my daughter's love, but because I no longer trusted who was standing behind her shoulder whispering in her ear. We rewrote my will to close every gap Marcus had been quietly probing for months. Pennsylvania, like a lot of states, only requires one party's consent to record a conversation, and Gerald confirmed it twice before I started keeping my phone in my shirt pocket, voice memo running, every time Marcus stopped by, unannounced, with another, just checking in. I got him on tape twice more over those 3 weeks, once calling my house the Vine Street lot, like it was a listing rather than a home, once mentioning that Fairview Senior Living has a waiting list, so if Walt's even thinking about it, sooner is better. The Thursday evening after everything was signed and locked in Gerald's office safe, I got a text from Renee. Marcus thought it'd be nice to do a family cookout, like old times, get everyone together before summer ends. I read it 3 times sitting on my back porch, and I understood immediately what it was. He wasn't planning a cookout. He was planning a stage, a warm afternoon full of family and good food where he could lay papers on a table in front of witnesses who'd only ever see a loving son-in-law trying to help an aging father-in-law plan responsibly. I texted back that I'd love that, and asked her to make sure everyone came. The more the better. I called Gerald that night and told him what was coming. I asked him to be there. He was quiet for a moment on the line, the particular quiet of a careful man running through implications, and then said, if he showed up to a family gathering in his professional capacity, Marcus would know immediately that something had shifted. I'm counting on it, I told him. He agreed to come at 4, said he hadn't been to a good cookout since his brother moved to Arizona, and told me to cook enough for everybody. That week I did the same things I'd have done for Carol, because some habits are how you keep loving somebody after they're gone. I cleaned the grill. I sanded down the old picnic table on my back patio, the one Carol had bought secondhand, and refinished herself the summer after we got married, and rubbed a fresh coat of oil into the wood until the grain came back to life under my hands. I called Danny and told him what I knew, all of it, in order, and asked if he and his wife could come. He said they wouldn't miss it for anything. I called Ray and told him what I needed from him, which was only the truth. The same words he'd already given me at my kitchen table. He said he'd say exactly what he saw and heard, same as always. That Saturday, I pulled out a box from the hall closet I hadn't opened in a while. Photographs from 30 years of summers. Carol standing by that same picnic table the week we brought it home. Renee at 6 years old with barbecue sauce on her chin holding up a chicken leg like a trophy. Me at the grill looking too young and too unaware of how good I had it. I sat with that box a long time and told Carol, out loud, in an empty kitchen, that I was going to make sure nobody took apart what we'd built together. The first car pulled into my driveway a little after 2. It was my sister, June, 70 years old, drove in from Youngstown with a container of her potato salad, hugged me at the gate longer than usual the way she'd done ever since Carol's funeral. Danny arrived with his wife and the baby, immediately started helping me set up folding chairs without being asked, same as he always did. Ray came through the gap in the hedge with his thermos and a store-bought pie, sat in his usual chair, gave me a small nod. Everything smelled like hickory smoke and cut grass, exactly the way a good Saturday is supposed to smell. Renee and Marcus arrived at 3, and Marcus came through the gate, carrying a leather portfolio that was doing a poor job of looking casual. His eyes swept the yard the second he stepped in, counting heads the way a man counts a room he's about to perform in. Renee kissed my cheek, said hi, Dad, in a voice carrying more weight than 2 syllables should hold, and told me the food smelled wonderful. It was Carol's rub, same as always. We ate around 3:30. The burgers were good. June's potato salad disappeared fast. Danny told a story about the baby's first trip to the grocery store that had everybody laughing, including, for a few minutes, me. Marcus ate and smiled and kept one hand resting near that leather portfolio the whole time, the way a man keeps his hand close to something he knows he's going to need soon. Around 4, as the plates were being cleared, Marcus cleared his throat and said he wanted to take a minute while everyone who loved me was here, and pulled a cream-colored folder out of the portfolio and set it on the table. He talked about how much I'd meant to this family, how proud he was to call me his father-in-law, how sometimes love means having hard conversations while everybody's still healthy enough to have them. He opened the folder to reveal 3 neatly tabbed documents and a glossy brochure for Fairview Senior Living, and said the plan was for the house to go through a managed sale, the proceeds funding a comfortable retirement for me, with anything left over going to Renee. Renee reached across the table and put her hand over mine, her fingers trembling slightly, and said, "Please, Dad, just look at it. For us. For the baby someday." I looked at the folder, I looked at my daughter's hand on mine, and I looked up, right as the back gate creaked open. The same gate I'd meant to oil for 2 years, and never gotten around to. Gerald Fisk stepped into the yard in a gray sport coat, briefcase in hand, looking like a man arriving at precisely the moment he intended. Marcus's pen stopped moving mid-motion. "Who is this?" he asked, and his voice had lost an inch of its smoothness already. "This," I said, "is my attorney." What happened over the next 20 minutes, I'll try to tell you the way it actually unfolded, because I think the order matters. Gerald introduced himself around the table, shook June's hand, nodded to Ray, and set his briefcase down on the corner of the table, not the center, just present, visible. He said he was glad everyone who loved me was gathered here today because it would save a great deal of time, and then he opened the first folder and read, in a voice with no theater in it at all, the dates and substance of 3 phone calls Marcus Farrell had made to his office over the past 4 months. The question about incapacity and control of assets. The question about guardianship and diminished capacity. The question about power of attorney authorizing a sale while the owner was still living in a care facility. June made a sound like the air had gone out of her. Renee turned to her husband with an expression sliding from confusion into something much colder in real time. "Those were hypothetical." "That," Marcus said, "I work in insurance. I think about risk professionally." Gerald said, without raising his voice at all, that hypothetical questions about a specific elderly homeowner's incapacity, asked repeatedly by that homeowner's son-in-law over 4 months, were not hypothetical in any sense that mattered. Then Gerald opened the second folder and played, from his phone, 12 seconds of a recording where Marcus's voice, clear as day, called my home the Vine Street lot and said the smart move at some point was to liquidate. He played a second clip where Marcus mentioned the waiting list at Fairview. Renee had both hands pressed flat against the table now, tears running down her face without a sound, the specific silent crying of someone too stunned yet to make noise. Ray stood up next, set his thermos down, and told the table exactly what he'd told me at my kitchen table weeks earlier, word for word. About the hedge, about the younger man with the leather folder, about the comps on Maple and Cedar by Friday. Marcus tried to interrupt him twice. Ray simply said, "I'm talking," and finished. The back gate creaked again. A young man in a sharp suit stood there, leather folder under his arm, face flushed with the particular discomfort of someone standing on the far side of a decision he'd already made and wasn't sure he had the courage for. "I'm sorry," he said. And he wasn't looking at Marcus when he said it. He was looking at Renee. "Who is that?" June asked, though everyone already suspected. "That's the realtor Marcus hired to price this house," I said. "So he'd know what he was going to walk away with once I was out of it." Tyler Brannigan told the table, in a voice gone flat trying to keep emotion out of it, that Marcus had approached him 3 months earlier describing a pre-market opportunity and told him the elderly owner was aware and preparing for a transition. Tyler said he'd run the comps, come back with a number around 430,000, put together a preliminary listing strategy, and then found out 2 months in that the owner had no idea any of it was happening. "I told him I was out," Tyler said. "I should have told somebody sooner. I felt sick about it for weeks." Renee turned to her husband and asked the only question that mattered by then, in a voice gone very quiet and very clear. "How much do you owe, Marcus?" He sat there a long moment, looking at the wood grain of that picnic table, like it might give him an answer he could live with. And then his shoulders dropped, and the whole performance that had carried him through the afternoon finally gave out. 190,000, he said, give or take. Bad investment in a strip mall project outside Meadville. It went sideways 18 months ago. Gerald set a single financial document on the table, obtained legally through the process of preparing my case, showing the repayment deadline was the end of that year. Marcus had needed money, fast, and a house he didn't own looked, to him, like the fastest way to get it. Danny stood up from his chair and walked to the edge of the patio, hands on his hips, not saying anything because there wasn't anything left worth saying that his silence didn't already say better. June reached over and took my hand. I stood up slowly, the way my knees insist on these days, and I looked at that old picnic table, the one Carol had refinished herself 31 summers ago, and I told everyone at that table about the week we bought it, about Renee at 6 years old eating too much corn on the cob, and Carol holding her hair back without a word of blame, about every Sunday and Saturday since, about the year the table sat quiet because Carol was gone, and the years after that, when I kept setting it anyway, because I believed, and still believe, that this is where family happens, whether or not the person who taught you that is still sitting in her chair. I looked at Renee. "I'm not asking you to choose anything today," I told her. "I'm asking you to know that none of this, not the boat, not this house, not one Saturday we've ever spent at this table, was ever about what any of it is worth in dollars. It was about you sitting across from me eating food your mother taught me to make, and knowing there was one place in this world that was always going to be yours." Renee pressed both hands over her mouth and her shoulders shook, and this time, she didn't try to hold it in. I turned to Marcus last. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, and whatever confidence had walked through my gate 3 hours earlier was gone completely, and what was left looked younger and far less sure of itself than anything I'd seen from him in 6 years. "I don't hate you," I told him, and I meant it, though it cost me something to say. "I've lived long enough to know that hating a man costs more than it ever gives back, but I'm not signing this." I picked up the cream-colored folder, folded it in half, and set it down in front of him. "This house is where my wife and I raised our daughter, and it's going to be here for my granddaughter and whoever comes after her, for as long as I can still stand at that grill. But there's no seat at this table for you anymore. Not after this." He looked at Renee one more time, opened his mouth like a sentence was forming, and thought better of it. Then he stood, picked up his portfolio, and walked out through the gate. Nobody watched him go. Not one person turned their head. Tyler Brannigan exhaled a long breath and asked Gerald if there was anything else he needed. Gerald said he'd be in touch, thanked him for coming, and Tyler let himself out the same gate, the creak of it the only sound in the yard for a moment. Ray reached for the tongs. "There's still burgers on that grill," he said, in the voice of a practical man raising a practical matter. June laughed. surprised at herself. The kind of laugh that breaks something loose in a room that's been holding its breath. Danny came back from the edge of the patio and checked the coals like nothing had happened, because that's the kind of steady young man he'd grown into. Gerald closed his briefcase with 2 quiet clicks and accepted a plate when June handed him one. Renee hadn't moved from her chair. I walked around the table and sat down beside her, not in Carol's chair, in the one that had always been mine, and she looked at me with her mother's eyes, dry now but changed somehow, and said, quietly, "I don't know what I'm going to do, Dad." I told her she didn't have to know today. She sat with that a moment, and then said the thing that told me everything was going to be all right eventually, even if it wasn't all right yet. "Emma's going to ask about that boat again. She loved that boat." "Then I'll build her a new one," I said. "Bigger. And this time I'll teach her how to rig the sails herself." Renee reached over and took my hand and held on, the way people hold on to something they've decided they need. Ray set a plate down in front of me, a burger, potato salad, corn, and told me not to let it get cold in the exact tone of a man who considers his part of the day's work finished. I picked up my fork. The yard was warm and gold in that late afternoon way, and for the first time in 4 years, sitting at that table, I felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't anger either. It was something closer to peace, the kind you only get to after you've stopped being afraid of an uncomfortable room. Here's what I've learned, and it took a burned boat and a car key at the bottom of a swimming pool for me to finally understand it. Being agreeable is not the same as being loved, and keeping quiet to keep a family comfortable is not the same as keeping that family safe. I spent years thinking my silence was a gift I was giving the people I loved. It wasn't a gift. It was just a slower way of disappearing. If I could tell my younger self one thing, it would be this. Don't wait until somebody's picking through the pieces of your life to decide it was worth protecting in the first place. I believe the right people show up exactly when you need them, if you're willing to let them. Ray was trimming that hedge for a reason. Gerald picked up that phone call for a reason. And every single person who sat at my table that Saturday was there because, somewhere along the way, they'd chosen to be the kind of people who show up. If any part of this reached you tonight, wherever you're listening from, I'd love to hear where that is. Drop it in the comments. Tell me your town, your state. Let me know who's out there with me. And if this story meant something to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. And stay close, because there's a lot more of this family's story still to tell.